much for having me. I've been in the US for a couple of weeks, and the main conversation I've been having with American activists is that they tell me, okay, maybe it's difficult where you're from, but you have it easy. Like, at home, here we have police brutality, we have homelessness, we have cutbacks, school and hospital closures. So I'm here to reassure you, comrades, we have the same at home. So basically, the biggest problem for the European ruling class is to address the high labor cost of European workers. So you had a welfare state that was born out of the Second World War, where basically you had big, even though reformist, you had big workers' party, and also a whole continent to be rebuilt. So basically, that's how the welfare states were born. So already in the 80s, what we call the neoliberal era, or the era of austerity, weakened already pretty strongly this idea of a welfare state. And now, in order to maintain its level of profit in a period of world competition, like globalization and so forth, the program of the European ruling classes, their agenda is clear, is to get rid of the remnants of the welfare state in order to finally address this issue of high labor costs in Europe. And the main pretext they're using is the issue of the debt. They tell to European workers, guys, you've been having the high life for so many years, so now you need to reimburse your follies. And we're all in the same boat. So actually, we know that we're not in the same boat, because what we've been facing for many years are low wages, unemployment, homelessness, poor health, impossibility to pay the bills, impossibility to make ends meet. So I'm sure you guys can relate to all of that. And we know that the money that was borrowed by the European states, virtually none of it was used for the people. All of it was used to give tax cuts to the rich, and also to bail out banks and big businesses. Actually, none of this money was virtually used for building roads, hospitals, or schools. So now the public debt for us, we know, is the private debt of the rich that the banks and the government are trying to make us pay. And I'm not even mentioning the high interest rate that were granted to the banks by the cronies. So now let us enter to the heart of the matter. So how are we trying to face these attacks? So now you have to break it down. I know you have to break it down because the attacks are taking part in a different sequence. So basically what happens in Northern Europe is that most of the attacks occurred before the crisis. So if you look at Scandinavia, Germany, Netherlands, or UK, for example, so you have neoliberal reforms were done in the past. The trade union bureaucracy is much more integrated to the state apparatus. And all of this led to profound demoralization of the working class and to political and social apathy. So in those countries, we saw some struggles against austerity, but they were mostly isolated and easily defeated. So there was like a big strike of train drivers in Germany, or there were a few years back strikes by public employees in England against the cutbacks, but these movements were easily defeated. So at the opposite, you have Southern Europe and Ireland, where austerity is hitting the hardest, and where the social movements were not destroyed in the past. So there were, at least in Greece, Spain and Portugal, huge day of general strike, called by the unions, and trade-based local strikes. So for example, the teacher strike in Greece and the movement against precarious work in Portugal. So sometimes we even have self-managed factories, like Rimaflow in Italy and Viome in Greece. There are also very radical movements outside the workplace, so the movements against polluting gold mines in the north of Greece. And there are also movements that were able to combine both inside and outside of the workplace activity. So like the movement against the hospital closures in Madrid, which managed to bind unions and communities together, and where they were actually able to defeat the plan of the government. So that's one of the seldom victories we had. But on total, like, there were very few victories, because the grip of the trade union bureaucrats on the working class is actually really fierce. And if they call these days of general actions, it was only for people to vent their anger, but not actually to challenge any kind of real austerity policies. And coupled with this austerity, you also have very strong attacks on democratic rights, women's rights, and minorities that are being waged by the ruling class, both to repress and divide working people. So on the electoral level, there is still no rise of the far left, but in Southern Europe, there are a few interesting developments one has to take into account. So mostly in Greece and Spain. So traditional political parties are discredited for two reasons. One of these reasons is that you had strong social movements, but another reason is it is very blunt and clear that the ruling classes are unable to solve their own crisis, because their main recipe for now has been austerity. So actually you lower the workers' purchasing power, but then they're unable to consume any kind of goods. So even though you have different ways to produce growth, one of the big ways is consumer spending, and consumer spending is at an all-time low. So it's like the snake biting his own tail. So my Greek comrade will elaborate about the Greek situation. I would say a few words about Spain, and then I will go on about France. So as in Greece, you had a acute crisis in Spain, and you also had strong social movements. And you had, but some wins were secured. So basically you have a party that was basically born out of almost nothing a year ago, Podemos. So we can. Born out a guy who was like a TV show host on the left and a small Trotskyist organization. And actually, because of this victory, because of this general mood to fighting, we had actually thousands and thousands of people who joined this organization. So a lot of them took part in the struggle against hospital closures, against layoffs in the sector of education, and in the square occupation movement. And a lot of them are unemployed youth with no prospects for future. So basically, the employment youth in Spain is about like 50%. And if you look, when the movement started in 2010 there, you had huge protests in, for example, London, Paris, or Amsterdam, because you have these hundreds of thousands of youth who actually have like a computer science degree, and they end up being made in like a Paris or Amsterdam hotel because there's no way they can find jobs at home. So, and as Podemos, the city council election took place, and Podemos was managed to get big results. But actually, it's kind of the same question that started in the beginning of the process arising. So, should we? Does this organization want to take power from above and facilitate coalitions with existing party, or take power from below? Does it advocate just for radical democracy, or does it advocate for a social program as well? So France is in between Northern and Southern Europe, so and shares some characteristics of both. So in the 80s, austerity was implemented in France by a government of the Socialist Party, so that is the center-left, allied with the Communist Party, which was more and more like not even like a reformist party. So basically, we had the privatization of public company, etc., but it never went as far as Thatcher or as Reagan. And also, so we still do have some level of trade union organizing and socialist organizing. And also, French economy is way more diversified and bigger than the economy of Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. So French gross domestic product is around $3 trillion. So that's 2.5 times Spain's. So what happened? So since the beginning of the crisis in 2009, there were lots of strikes and fights against layoff and business closures in France. So virtually every industry was impacted. So retail, auto, manufacturing, everything. So the rhetoric of the boss is always the same. So they say they don't have any kind of money to invest, that the bank vault is empty, that they need to downside, even though we know they've been piling up money for years. But the problem of all these struggles is that they remain isolated, and ultimately they failed to achieve their primary goal. So in 2009 especially, we had in the parts supplier, for example, tire factories that make tire or that make the seats for the cars. We had a lot of layoff in 2009, and there were lots of fights, and their main goal was always to prevent the closures. But since they didn't have enough momentum to do that, they were able to get huge severance packages, which was already something. For example, one tire factory, Continental, they went on strike for several months, and they managed, for workers with seniority, they managed to have a severance package of 120,000 euros, so $150,000, whereas if they hadn't fought, they would have had like 12,000. So that was among the big fights. But basically in 2010 we had a big fight against a pension scheme that would actually lengthen the time you have to work. But none of these movements were able to win. And what makes it worse is since 2012 we have a government of the left, so of the Socialist Party, allied with the Greens, which is not like the Green Party here, which is less radical, let's say. And basically, since we have this government, the main excuse of the trade union bureaucracy has been to say, oh, we have the left in power. Even though they're screwing us as bad as the right wing, we shouldn't fight them, because otherwise we encourage the right and we strengthen the right wing. But when the left wing is doing the same thing than the right, this rationale doesn't really make sense. But at least it was the excuse of the trade union bureaucrats not to do anything. So if you look at the record of this government, like I was, we were talking with another comrade, and he told me that Obama was the top deporter in US history. They had deported 2 million people. Well, actually, our left-wing government, they're the top deporter, the top privatizers of public company, the top police brutality government. I mean, they've been getting away with stuff that no right-wing government would have dared before. So they were the first to ban protest. So protests have been banned in many years. So the protest for the Palestine solidarity, they said that if you work in solidarity with Palestine, it means you're anti-Semitic. So basically they banned the protest, and we were the only political party to challenge the ban. So that was like, yeah, there was something, there maybe like a lot of immigrants and youth came out, but basically the cops surrounded us, so they were like four-way street. So they closed 3-way, and then they closed the 4th way, which made that there was no way we could go out. And then the tear gas canister started like raining like crazy. So like that was kind of, yeah, that's the government of the left, basically. So we have that, a government that's a trade unionist by the post office, has been laid off of his job for trade union activity. It's the first time this happened in France since 1951. This government is clearly not a friend of the workers. And basically, in the last few months, they've been waging all of these attacks in the name of free speech. So basically, we had on the 6th of January, we had the terrorist attacks against Charlie Hebdo and a kosher grocery store, where 17 people were killed in total. And on the 11th of January, we had like huge protests that were called by the government. Actually, these protests were used to against the social movement and to further the racist agenda of the ruling classes. One only had to take a look at who were the people taking part in it. So basically, you had about 50 heads of state who were leading the protest. So the Ukrainian dictator Poroshenko, who governs allied with the fascist and anti-Semitic forces. Netanyahu was there, so who killed 1,000 Palestinians in July, including 17 journalists. All the dictators of West Africa, loyal servants to the French state, who usually shoot at their opponents using the army. I mean, everybody was there. There was like Rajoy, who wanted to deny Spanish women the right to have an abortion. Merkel and Hollande, the French and German president, who were strangling the Greek working classes for the debt. And the French prime minister was guilty of all of the above. So basically, the list of these murders and their crimes is too long to tell. So for the ruling classes, so these protests were an opportunity to strengthen their grip on society under the name of national unity, which is a barely hidden reformulation of the theory of the clash of civilization. So basically, the enemy is not the boss, but it's your Muslim co-workers and neighbors. So everybody, so apart from these heads of state, all the French political parties, from the left to the right, except the revolutionaries, so Trotskyists, Maoists, and anarchists, took part in this protest. But then at the protest, people, among the several millions of people who went there, they went there for various reasons. You can see some people simply wanted to state that one should not be killed because it was religious satire is Jewish. And people were putting very different things in I Am Charlie. And for example, there's a generational divide because the Charlie Hebdo newspaper started having its Islamophobic line in the year 2000. And before, it was a journal that was pretty friendly to the workers' movement and also to the undocumented workers' movement. And basically, their main opponent was the Catholic Church. And so all the other comrades were saying, this newspaper sucks. They wouldn't understand because they would say, oh, but they draw free cartoons in support of strikers or undocumented youth. Why do you say they suck? So there was a generational divide. And among the people who said I am not Charlie, some of them, so in people saying I am Charlie, you had various stuff, but in I am not Charlie, you had some stuff, some differences as well. Because on the people that refused to take part in a minute of silence, some said because it's national unity and stuff, and some said they wouldn't have a minute of silence for the Jews. So basically, this kind of events, it brings out all the trash that remains on the bottom of society. So both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So basically, it also showed the fact that the workers' movement is pretty much integrated to the state apparatus because the main trade union federation all called in support of this protest. Yeah, like there was like, apart from a very few revolutionary organization, everybody went to this protest and supported them. So in the beginning, we were extremely isolated because people around us would say, "Oh, it's a freedom for the freedom of expression. Are you an opponent of the freedom of expression?" But then, because we tirelessly explained our position, people started to realize that it was a big scam and that their feelings were hijacked by the government for their own interest. Especially the issue of the presence of the heads of state, which many people were not really clear about in the beginning. It really showed them that they had been screwed over by the state. So yeah, basically we identified two ways to fight against racism. So one of the ways is to tirelessly denounce racist attacks. And another way is also to fact that we need social struggles in order to bring people together. So I told you about the 2009 and 2010 strikes, but since then our movements against austerity have been pretty weak. So it's hard to go to working people and just tell them, "Oh, you're all brothers and you're all friends," if you're not able to demonstrate concretely that common struggle would actually achieve some effects. So in the rise of racist and reactionary ideas, you have two elements. One is the pervasiveness of all forces from the left to the right to the racist idea, and one is the rise of the National Front, which is the far-right party in France. And also, in the last few years, there's been an evolution of this party, which asks us many questions on how to resist it. Because it went from being a small anti-Semitic fascist grouping, whose main idea was to say, we're going to seize power by violence and kill the Jews, the immigrants, and the leftists, to the kind of a broad conservative party that has people who are elected in city council and stuff. So it doesn't mean that they are less dangerous, but they're dangerous in a different and more subtle way. So I want us to go back to their history. So they started out in the 70s as a small group of fascist, monarchists, any kind of right-wing nut was in there, and their main stuff was to try to kick the shit out of leftist militants. And it rose to prominence in the 80s as the electoral party, pushed as by two factors. One is the economic crisis, and the second one is the fact that we had a left government that was screwing people over. So basically, people told themselves, okay, the right wing screwed us, the left wing screwed us, let's go with the far right because they're a party that's against the system. Because this party, as with like all far right party, like the Tea Party here, even though they're the closest to the elites, they're always ranting about like we're against the elite, we're against the big people, we're rooting out for the small guy and stuff. So they were able to capture some sector. And basically their main motto at the time was 3 million unemployed is 3 million additional immigrants we don't need. And they were able to get some electoral base in the working class, but most of their voters were petty bourgeois sectors, shopkeepers and the like. And it was a party that was accustomed to scandal. So its representative in the European Parliament and President Jean-Marie Le Pen, he said in '96 in the European Parliament that the gas chambers were but a detail of history. And the money backers of the National Front were mainly old industrialists that were either monarchist or fascist. So in the 90s, due to internecine struggle, the party collapsed and almost disappeared because each of its leaders wanted to have a share of the pie. But it rose to prominence again in the year 2000, and in 2002 they were able, we have a 2-round presidential election, so they're able to eliminate the left wing, and the second round was far right against the right. So how did that happen? So they were able to portray themselves and to be less reactionary on some aspects, and really portray themselves, multiply their populist strengths against the corrupt elite and international capital, and they managed to portray themselves as a party that's outside of the system. So the current crisis of the National Front leadership exemplifies this evolution because the father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, he reiterated what he said about the gas chamber being a detail of history and about collaborating with the German with the best stuff that happened to France. So basically, after a few weeks of media frenzy, he was thrown out of the party by his own daughter and by the new cadres of the National Front. So basically the fact that this is the evolution of a strategy that's been going on for 10 years. So there's a lot of elected officials, and now the money comes from the election. It doesn't come from the old fascist industrialists that used to be their money backer. And one example is, for example, they went from being an openly anti-Semitic party to a pro-Zionist party in like 10 to 15 years. So they completely, they change in a certain way. Even though they still have a security detail of 500, or mostly former military and former cops, and they keep relationship with a lot of fascist groupings. But it's kind of a love and hate relationship, so they use them, but most of the time they don't want to be seen with them, because now they want to appear respectable. And what's new also is that the National Front was able to play a role in labor struggle, which had never happened in France, like in the last 60 years or so. So for example, in the region of Brittany, west of France, there are thousands and thousands of layoffs in the meatpacking industry. So while you had workers protesting against the layoffs, you had a movement called the Red Hat, so that's a symbol of the French Revolution, of shopkeepers and truck company owners against some green tax. And basically, due to the influence of the National Front among some layers, among some like very shady trade union bureaucrats, they were able to unite all these movements together and put themselves at the head of it. And their general demand was down with the Romanians and the Bulgarians who were stealing our jobs. So they were able to lead that struggle. So for the whole left, it was a big issue. Should we go into that movement and challenge their grip, or should we stand aside and denounce it as a fascist movement? So basically that's what the CP and most of the trade union bureaucracy did. They just said, oh, like these workers have a slave-like mentality, and so we organized a separate protest, and their protests were pretty ridiculous. So we went there with a few activists, and basically we had our own banner and our own section of the protest which said, not down with the Romanians, but down with the layoffs. And we were able to attract thousands and thousands of workers. So the idea here is not, there are two ideas. One is that the far right is evolving from a fascist small grouping to like a big conservative party. And so we have to really address the perversiveness of the working class to their ideas. And the second one is that we're in a historical period where mobilization are less and less chemically pure. So with the rise of the crisis, you have the rise of chauvinism and nationalism. And for us, it's a big question. Like if you in the Palestine protest, so there were so many rants in the American media about these protests were anti-Semitic, that when I was interviewed by Socialist Action Comrade, I said what was true, that wasn't the case. But you had some section of when we had the 30,000 march people, which was the biggest Palestine solidarity march in many years, you had the 2,000 contingents of a group that was linked with Hezbollah. And so that was the official protest. But when the banned protest, the problem is that the only people showing up were us and these guys. So we would fight for leadership against these guys because they mostly had anti-Semitic chants, and their politics is mainly furthering the idea of the shock of civilization. So this is stuff we didn't used to face and that we're facing now. So now I'm gonna go quickly into like the stuff I've been doing as an organizer in the past few months. On a personal level, I've been involved in the struggle for undocumented youth. So basically, in France, you have thousands and thousands of youth that come from either West Africa or either from Afghanistan. So usually people wait to be older in order to do the crossing. But these kids, they have family problem with their family, broken homes and stuff like that. So they came under 18. And what the French law says is that if you're under 18, regardless of your nationality, whether you're French or foreign, you should be taken care of by child services if your parents are not there. But basically, child services in the city of Paris and the whole France, they invented a lot of arbitrary ways to determine your age in order to exclude all these foreign kids. So first, they're going to have someone with a law degree interview you for half an hour and making you, for example, trying to make you stumble, like interrogation. And basically, they're going to say, oh, what you say makes too much sense, so you cannot be a minor, because what you're saying is too coherent. Then they're going to do bone structure tests. So these tests were invented when people have growth issue, so it allows you to determine a course of treatment. So here they're used to determine the age, but European and even French courts said that these tests were completely inaccurate and that they meant nothing. And they also use, they're going to ask the kids to bring all sorts of documents that they have, so birth certificates, school records, ID cards, but 100% of the time they will say, these stuff are fake. So the kids manage to get some money, use Western Union to send money home to get these kind of papers, but the judge are going to declare them fake anyway. What happened is that child services in my neighborhood, we started seeing like dozens of these kids sleeping in the streets. So basically we formed a coalition with trade union, socialist organization and some NGOs with two goals. One of the goals was to try and find an immediate solution to the most pressing issue, food, housing, like however we could put it. Another one was to force City Hall and child services to respect the law. So basically the movement has been lasting for 4 months, is still ongoing. So what we did is that we occupied the building of child services. We did weekly protests in front of child services or other places. We did what you became familiar with Occupy, so we did square encampments. So for 15 days in front of child services, then we remained for a month in one of the most famous square of Paris, which is called the Square of the Republic. And basically, you know, you're supposed to be the top tourist city of the world, and you go into one of the main square of the city, and you have 300 black people sleeping in a shanty town. You know, it kind of destroys your image. So after a month, basically the Department of Housing told us, okay, like, you will have housing. So we had housing and food for the 43 kids that were in the struggle, and now we're trying to get them enrolled into school. So basically, okay, the Board of Education is screwing us over because they said yes. Then they said you have to produce some kind of documentation. Then they say no. Basically, we're still in a movement about that, and we got some support from the teachers' union. So that's one of the stuff I've been doing for the past 4 months. And I think this stuff shows that, I mean, as revolutionaries, we're pretty dependent on the situation. So we're not going to create struggles just because we're tough and smart and beautiful, because you have to mention that revolutionaries are always most beautiful than the average. At least that's my experience. But it's not only out of our smartness and willingness that we're going to do stuff. So we're dependent on general situation. But in times of crisis, there might be some openings, and we have to be bold about it. Sometimes, basically, when we go into the field, so now we have to wrestle with trade union bureaucrats, fascists, kind of identity. In France, we don't have identity. We don't have community organization, but we have a few cultural nationalist groups. But they are, I mean, anti-Semitic, anti-abortion, all of this stuff. So these guys want to go to the field, like religious group, and try to play a role too. So basically, you have like strong competition from bad people. So we shouldn't only be the people who talk the talk, but we have to walk the walk. We have to be involved, because as I was discussing, in Philadelphia, we had a forum, and we had a lot of young African-American people that got involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And basically, the 4 panelists, so I won't tell you the age of the 3 other panelists, but most of them had gotten involved at the time of the civil rights movement. So basically, a young guy, what he was saying was that, I believe everything that you say, but tell me something I can relate to. And that's the main stuff we have to do. We have to have these concrete wins, partial wins. To win housing for 43 kids, it's not revolution. It's far away from that. But if you're able to go to your coworkers, go to your friends, go to people you meet out flying, and tell them, look, like Brett said, so if we fight, we're not sure of winning, but if we don't fight, we're sure of losing. So that's why we have to try and take each and every opportunity to do some stuff. Thank you very much.
Hello. I will focus on Greece not only because I come from there and I know this issue better than other stuff about Europe, but because Greece in particular has attracted international attention since at least 2010 because of 2 reasons. And the first one being the extraordinary intensity of the capitalist crisis as we had it in Greece. At some point, Greece was not anymore able, not exactly to pay the public debt, because back in 2010, when it all started, the public debt in Greece actually was not of that extraordinary amount comparing to other countries. It was something like 120% of the GDP, which is a lot, but it's not enormous. It's less than Japan, for example. But the problem was that they could not borrow money in order to repay their older debts, their past debts, because there was something like a crisis of credibility. Investors thought, for some reason, that Greece was more probable for a default on their debt than other countries, so the interest rates went like exploded, and then the Greek governments had to find another way, so they had to borrow money from governments and states instead of private banks. This is the first reason why why Greece has attracted all this attention. The second reason has been the mass movement that shook the country for at least 5 years and that ended up with the election of a government that is supposed to be left. So in 2010, May 2010, back at this time, we had a social democratic government, which means a government formed by the Socialist Party, the PASOK, which was supposed to be a party, of course, a reformist party, but supposedly something more progressive than the right-wing parties. But actually, it had already turned into a fully bourgeois party, and actually they were the one that first scheduled and performed the massive attack against the working class of Greece. So social democracy, the classic definition has been that they were like bourgeois labor parties, but I think that in the case of Europe, most of them have fully turned into bourgeois parties. So they signed a treaty with the so-called Troika. The Troika is the European Central Bank, the European Union, and the IMF. So the Greek government signed a treaty with them, which meant that those parts would lend money to Greece on the condition that Greece would apply an austerity pact, the so-called memorandum. What actually happened is that the public debt turned into debt towards states, as I told you before, but states that, unlike banks, have the political means to put pressure on countries in order to pay the debt back, because the bank cannot do anything. It's part of the risk what they take. But a state can claim many more things. So goes by itself that all loans came on heavy political conditions for the working class. So this is when it all started. Anyway, I'll very quickly go through this devastating situation for the working class and the oppressed, which included an average income loss for working people of more than 40%. Then we have numerous hospitals and schools closed all around the country, which is something of neo-barbarian evolution. And we have actually collective bargaining having been abolished, because now individual contracts are considered to be superior to collective contracts. So it's like abolishing collective bargaining, actually. Then we have suicides, homelessness, poverty, etc. But what is more interesting, I suppose, is to focus a little bit on the mass movements themselves, because it's something that has not only attracted attention but inspired people in other countries. The mass movement in Greece could be divided into two distinct phases. The first one being from 2010 up to 2012, and then it is 2012 to our own time now. Between 2010 and 2012, we have had explosive struggles, nearly everyday struggles. We have had about 30 days of general strikes. General strikes meaning that everybody, strike all over production. In 3 cases, we had 2-day general strike. Unfortunately, the rest were too far from each other. So we had 30 days of general strike, but it was one month later, etc., so they were not that effective. Then we had square occupation movement, the so-called indignados. As mass movement brought hundreds of thousands of people every day in the Syntagma Square, which is the biggest square in the center of Athens, for over a month. And the same also happened in all towns of Greece. It was a massive movement that lasted over a month, and it was occupied by the Spanish occupation of Plaza del Sol, and it was something that could be paralleled to the Occupy Wall Street movement here. Despite all all the contradictions that this movement had, its peak has been like 500,000 people in the center of Athens in one day. However, the culmination of the mass movement has not been June 2011, which was the period of the Indignados movement, but it has been October 2011, because this was the time when the legacy of the Indignados movement and the square occupation movement met the organized workers' movement. So at the same time, we have had people back to the squares, people occupying public buildings, and workers striking or making workers' demonstrations. So it was combined, and this really created an explosive situation and made the government resign. But unfortunately, they resigned in favor of a national unity government of technocrats that was also supported by the extreme right, the equivalent, more or less, of the National Front, which in Greece is called Laos. So by that time, we have already, it was already obvious that we had a massive and rapid radicalization and maturation of the people, of militants. So there were really big masses that have already adopted or at least were discussing very radical claims and demands, such as stop paying off and fully cancel the debt, because it's not the working class, it's not normal, ordinary people that created it. It's not, we did not profit out of this debt, so we shouldn't pay it. If the bosses want to pay it, let them do it, but they don't. But they won't. So cancel the debt. And second, we have had the massive adoption of the demand for direct democracy, which means another type of democracy against parliamentary authoritarianism. There were many people questioning themselves. Why should we only vote once every 4 years and not make our own decisions through our popular assemblies? We have voted for them. They had done completely different things than they have promised. So why can't we not call them back? So there was a real discussion and deep reflection. But unfortunately, at some point, this seemed to end. So after a last big outburst in February 2012, when we had, again, a two-day general strike and a very big demonstration of 500,000 again. But after this last outburst, we had a relative retreat of the mass movement. There were still important militant experiences ever since, but nothing to compare with what happened in this first phase. There were still important struggles in different sectors, workers' struggles. There was also the big anti-fascist movement, but it was not the same anymore. I suppose that it would be of some interest to say a few words about the fight against Nazis in Greece, because I think that most of you will know that among other crappy things we had in Greece in this period, we also experienced the abrupt and sudden extreme rise of a Nazi party, not simply extreme right nationalist party. It's like the stereotype of a Nazi party, the so-called Golden Dawn. So this group existed for nearly 30 years. They have been attacking people during all this period, and sometimes they have also committed lethal attacks, but they never achieved to play some role in the central political scene, like some real political role. They were like a Nazi group, dangerous group, but marginalized group. However, it turned out that they are now the third party in the vote. And it could have been much worse had it not been for the anti-fascist movement. What were the reasons for this unexpected, for some people unexpected rise? So, first of all, it was the crisis itself that provoked massive despair for individualized strata, small shop owners, small petit bourgeois strata, even strata of the working class that are individualized, not unionized, anyway, people that feel that their lives are pressured, but they don't know exactly who to blame. This is the first reason, and the second reason is that this Nazi party has been scandalously promoted by the mass media for a while, and by the government itself. By that time we had a government that was led by the right-wing party again, and in coalition with the Social Democrats. So the government scandalously favored the group in order first to distract social anger from the mass movement, I mean from strikes, etc. Second, to terrorize immigrants, leftists, unionists, etc. And this is exactly what they did. They started attacking immigrants first, then they went on to unionists, and then they ended up, even attacking Communist Party parliamentary live on air in the television. So for some period, the right-wing government had even plans to let them in the government. But this all failed at some point, and the situation is much better now, because we don't have that big amount of attacks anymore. We don't have Nazi battalions patrolling around Athens, which we had for a period, unfortunately. And their popularity is still big, but not growing. They can take like 5 to 7% in the national vote, which is enormous for the Nazi party. But according to the polls, 2 years ago, they could get 15 or even 18%. At some point, we were also afraid that they would elect the mayor of Athens. At some point, they went too far, because it's different. And it sounds awful, and it is awful, but it's actually different to kill an undocumented Pakistani, which they did. And at the end, they killed a well-known hip-hop singer, anti-fascist, Pavlos Fyssas, also known as Kilape. But this was too much, because now everybody knew. Okay, there were people that say, okay, it's not good to kill immigrants, but they take our jobs. But it's obvious that a hip-hop singer does not take your job, because you will not be a singer anyway. Not everybody can. After this murder happened, there was a really mass anti-fascist movement that pressured the government to take some actions against them. They persecuted them, and now they are in court. Actually, the government would not have been forced to take these measures had it not been for the anti-fascist movement. So it was the only sector of the mass movement that among that setback that I described before was growing. In the beginning, it was very difficult, and we tried three different ways at the same time. First, we tried to kick them out of the unions, or use the trade unions against them. In theory, this is ideal, but it didn't entirely work. In some cases, it did work. For example, the National Federation of Workers in the local government workers, which is one of the biggest federation of workers in Greece, made a campaign and took the decision to kick all people that are suspect to vote for the Nazis out of the union. This was something good, for example. Or we had a similar decision in various university student unions. But again, it was not true, unfortunately, that the union themselves organized mass action against fascists. So we tried another way, which was try to form locally based popular assemblies or committees against the Nazis. This was a task which the far left and anarchists mostly undertook. A big part of the reformist party, the big part of the traditional left, which is the Communist Party and the majority of Syriza, did not enter. Nevertheless, those local committees were extremely valuable because they made the first caucus of people to react. And then the third thing we did is organize big demonstrations from time to time, and the best of them were the ones that headed against the Nazi headquarters, because it was both symbolic and something that really scared them. Because you cannot fight fascists by being extremely humanitarian. You have to also threaten them, because they profit because they seem invincible. If somebody sees them hiding behind the police because they are afraid of the crowd, this is not good for them. Culmination of this, 1 week after Pavlos Fyssas' murder, when the far left and some anarchist groups organized a rally against the Nazi national headquarters. Despite this rally was boycotted by the big left parties, both the big left parties, it managed to bring together more than 30,000 people that marched against the national headquarters. This was the beginning of their end, for the time being. So, what are the reasons of the setback of the mass movement, apart from the anti-fascist movement? I think that there are some objective limitations, because people mobilized, they did heroic things, but they didn't win. But I think that this is not adequate a political explanation, because if we have to give a political explanation, it's not just comment. It is to also take into account the role of the leaderships. So both unionist leaderships and political leaderships. As I told you before, what the unions that were actually controlled by the government, their leaderships. I mean, their strategy was not to not call for any strike, because this would mean that they would be kicked out the very next day. People would get extremely angry against them. But the strategy was to call for days of general strike too far from each other, so that there is no cumulative result. On the other hand, the leaderships of the big parties of the left tried something different. What they tried to say, more or less, was the same, that nothing can be achieved if the parliamentary relation of forces doesn't change before. So what the big left parties told the people is wait for the elections and then we will overthrow them. But this meant that people went back home, waiting. They relied on this expectation. They had the illusion that only by voting they could change the world. And unfortunately, this is not true as we are experiencing now, as we are seeing now. So, a few words about the parties. We have the Communist Party in Greece, which is a big party, a typical Communist party. A party that has gone through all the stages of the evolution of Communist Party. Being in the beginning, it was extremely Stalinist, then it went Khrushchevite, and then Brezhnevite, and then Gorbachev, and then in the 90s they had a neo-Stalinist turn. So they are like a anti-democratic party. They are rooted in the working class, but at the same time they are extremely sectarian and reformist. So what they say is that nothing can change if our party is not reinforced first. On the other hand, we have Syriza, which is the party that leads the government now. And Syriza comes from the Euro-communist tradition. It was a tradition of the communist parties of France, Italy, and Spain back in the late 60s and early 70s, when what they said is that a revolution is not anymore relevant. Let's try to change things through the institutions, through taking power through the parliament, etc. So they actually rejected the idea of the revolution and they went reformist the classical way. So more or less, this is the background of our ruling party. Now, this party was elected easily in January, and this happened because people really hated the previous government. They hated those governments that bad that they would vote for Syriza no matter what they said. And at some point, Syriza realized it, and they rejected the most radical of their demands, so that they would not have to fulfill them afterwards. They didn't need them in order to win. People were already a little apathetic, and so Syriza were easily elected on a minimum program promising first to repeal the memoranda, the austerity pacts, and second to use the money that were meant to safeguard banks, use them for a minimum welfare. Actually, they couldn't do any of those two promises, but already those two promises were already more. At the same time, the Syriza leadership was trying to negotiate with the bourgeois class, both domestic and European, in order not to be too bad fought against when they take power. So now, is it good or bad that they were elected? We didn't vote for them, but nevertheless, I would say that it is a good thing that they were elected, provided that we have no illusions about their nature. This government is a softer government than the previous one. It's a government that is more vulnerable to our pressures because they have more recent links to the mass movement, so they're accountable in a way. But it's not a government of our own. It's not a government of the workers. It's not a government of the oppressed, and we have to be clear on that. We would have to give a class definition of the government, apart from saying that it's not left enough. Apparently it's not left enough, but left is not exactly a Marxist term. So is it a workers' government, bourgeois government? What is this government, this damn government? It is, in my opinion, it is a class collaboration government. which means that their program is something that tries to invent an unfeasible compromise between the interests of the workers and the interests of the bourgeois class. But unfortunately, any kind of compromise is in the final analysis to the profit, to the advantage of the upper class, of capitalists. So in these terms, you could say that it's even, I would dare to say that it's even a bourgeois government formed by a non-yet bourgeois, fully bourgeoisified party. There is a difference between the party and the government. And so, it is a class collaboration government, both in terms of its composition and of its program. In terms of its composition, it's not only Syriza themselves, the left post-Euro Communist Party. The government also includes a right nationalist party, right-wing nationalist party, named the Independent Greeks. They're split from the mainstream Christian Democratic Party, and at some point, on some issues, they even have views that are even to the right, among other on national issues. They're extremely nationalist. So, among other positions they have, the independent Greeks have the Minister of Military Affairs. So, the army is under the control of the far-right nationalist party, Independent Greeks. At the same time, apart from this party, we have lots of social democrats, I mean traditional social democrats that come from the bourgeoisified socialist party or similar parties that are now part of the government without being part of the Syriza party. Among others, we have an extremely conservative social democrat that is the minister of the so-called citizens protection, which means actually that he's the head of the police. So both the police and the army are not in the hands of the left. The left did not try to control the armed forces of the state. So in terms of the program, the government actually, in general, we could say that all concessions that the government promises to the working class depend on the competitiveness and profitability of Greek capitalism. And this is not only my assessment, it's what they say. They clearly say that, for example, they had promised to raise the minimum wage from the ridiculous, according to the prices in Greece, amount of 560 euros, that is now up to 750, which is not adequate anyway. 5 years ago, Syriza ran a campaign, an electoral campaign, on the slogan, "We will not be the generation of 700 euros." And now they won the election by the same slogan. We will be, well, the opposite slogan. We will be the generation of 700. Because meanwhile, the minimum wage has gone down to 500. Anyway, even raising the minimum wage back to up to 700, it would be good. But what they said the day after they won the election is that we will do that at some point, but on the condition that we have growth again. So it depends on the capitalist economy. That's true. That's clear. They have absolute respect to the right of capitalist private property. That's why they have renounced their former commitments to stop privatization, not renationalize it. This is out of the question anyway. But now they are negotiating for new privatization. For example, they are thinking of selling the railway to Russian capitalists. So they have an absolute respect to the capitalist private property, to the institutions of the state, to the imperialist European Union. So it's not a surprise that further retreats occur every day. A few words about what to be done. I think that first of all, what we have to do is not wait. If we don't act right now, no government will grant anything to us. This is something simple and something important. We have to mobilize now and put pressure before the situation stabilizes. We have to not let the situation stabilize. So we need united action by all means possible. We will defend possible progressive measures, as I told you before. But the most important thing is that we need an anti-capitalist alternative. We need a workers' opposition, independent workers' opposition to this government, because for the time being, the only visible opposition is the right. And if the government fails to fulfill their commitment to the people, and the only opposition is the right and the extreme right, then God save us all, or whoever is upstairs. So we need an independent left opposition to avoid catastrophe, and we need the politically and organizationally independent revolutionary political subject to lead this opposition. We don't think that the internal opposition within Syriza party is effective. Actually, they have not managed to block any single capitulation or concession all those years. So they are not effective at all. Very recently, the whole left, the broadest left, I mean every dissident within Syriza, all different oppositional groups allied to challenge the new agreement that the government is about to sign with the European Union and the IMF, which will be an agreement to extend the program in Greece, which will mean new taxes for workers. So the whole left of the party allied, and they still couldn't challenge this agreement. For example, nobody dared to vote against the nomination of a right-wing politician as the president of Greece, of the Republic. It was the first thing that Syriza did. They could elect whoever they liked because they had the majority. And they opted for a traditional right-winger so as to achieve national unity. Describe their own government as a national salvation government. That's why they react this way. So we need something. And my final point is that this is not something abstract, because I could say that we need an alternative. Okay, but there is no alternative. So do something. I know that in various countries this is the situation. When we have reformist left parties challenging the bourgeois parties, the traditional bourgeois parties, and being able to form a kind of different government, then at some places we may vote for them in different countries. But in Greece, we already have this social material, this social ground to have an independent anti-capitalist subject. There is quite a big and influential vanguard of people that are already independent from reforming, and they have led lots of struggles in unions, in the universities. The student university movement is one of the most prominent in Greece. So above all, the best chance we have to achieve such an anti-capitalist subject is ANTARSYA. ANTARSYA is an anti-capitalist front. Back in 2009, we have like 3,000 members all around Greece. The very important thing is that this subject is independent from governmentalism. So what we basically tell people is stand up for your rights, your own. Don't wait for any government to save you, because it won't happen. It will never happen if you don't do something yourself. So at the same time, we build our own revolutionary current within the front, because we have different traditions, as I told you, and different estimations. But we think that our first priority is to stabilize our relation with these vanguard militants, and not just choose for the lesser evil for our class. So not just vote for reformists because they may be the lesser evil. We need to build our own alternative, and I hope that we can do it in the specific context of Greece. Thank you, and excuse me for taking too much time. So